So I'm Candy Pileski. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Strategic Planning Task Force. And tonight is the last of the town hall meetings that we are going to be doing. At least in April. We anticipate doing several more as we progress through the work of this team. This meeting will last about an hour and a half. And we will be talking to you about what it is that the team has been doing, what our goal and our process is, and sharing the results of the survey that we did earlier this year. The other people who are on the committee include Jan Hicks, who's the other co-chair, and Jason Kraft, Tom Green, Tanya Arneson, and Greg Lawton. At the end, we're going to ask you some questions, and we ask that you save your questions until the end so that we'll get through the presentation. You might want to take some notes so that you can remember what it was that you might wanted to ask about. Chat is always open on Zoom, so people will be monitoring the chat. Anybody can see it, and we are recording this particular town hall so that we can share it with others in the future. Oh.
Candy, you're muted.
Have I been muted through that whole thing? Did you hear any of it?
Nope, just when you put this slide up, so you're good to go through the agenda.
Well, good. I will remind folks that this session is recorded tonight. That was at the request of somebody who is not able to attend. So, and I ask that you hold your questions until the end. And what we're going to be talking about tonight are the Strategic Planning Task Force team, our goals and the process that we're using. We're going to provide you some feedback on the survey, things that are outside the scope of the Strategic Task Force. We'll let you know what those are and who the contact is. And then we'll spend a lot of time talking about the results of the survey and talk about next steps. The other people, what you missed when I was talking to myself a few minutes ago. The other co-chair is Jan Hicks, and other members of the strategic planning team are Jason Kraft, Tom Green, Tanya Arneson, and Deacon Greg Lawton. That's all on the slide. There. Did I get to the right one? I did. Jason's going to talk about the vision and how we are addressing that in the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Candy. So we thought it would be helpful just to give some background information on how we got here and what steps we've kind of been taking. So we'll step back a little bit and go to September of 2019, which feels like a really long time ago considering COVID and everything we faced since that time. So Pastor Tanya invited the congregation on a Saturday in September to get together as a group. We sat around at tables and we discussed through a vision workshop, what were those values, what were those things that historically we've appreciated about our church, what things we hold dear currently, and what those things are, what are most important for our church going forward. So through the course of that morning, we really, spent that time discussing with our friends and our fellow congregation, those things that were most important. And so out of that vision workshop, we had a series of notes, and at each table, we took the notes from those table discussions. And that workshop was really kind of a jumping off point for us in terms of following into the next step, which was the vision writing team that Pastor Tanya developed. And that consisted of John Hawthorne, Pastor Tanya, Sarah Benedetto, and myself. And we got together in the fall of 2019, typically during What a Wednesday dinners. We got together as a team, and we took all of those notes and all of those ideas and all of those values that the church sat down and said were important. And our task was to come up with a vision statement for the church going forward. And so we spent multiple Wednesdays gathered together, praying about and really thinking about all of those things and all of those discussions that took place by the church during that vision workshop. And we developed a vision statement for our church. And so once that was developed, that was presented to the leadership council, who approved it. And then we presented that vision statement to the church as a whole, where it was affirmed by the congregation. And so now you see that vision statement presented, in all of our marketing documents. It's on our website. It's on every bulletin every Sunday. So our goal is to get that vision statement in front of everybody on a pretty frequent basis. Following the affirmation of the vision statement, that takes us to March of 2020, where Pastor Tanya invited a number of members of the congregation to form this strategic planning task force, whose goal is really to figure out how do we live into that vision. So we've created the vision statement, but what are those things we need to do as a church to live out that vision? And so we've been following a process, which takes us right up here now to the congregational study, really is how we're looking at this, whereby last month we sent out these surveys, we've collected those survey results, and now we're here tonight discussing those results with you. So that brings us kind of a quick overlay of the historical steps we've taken in terms of the vision process.
Thanks, Jason. So as he said, the vision here, we are an inclusive, intergenerational faith community that loves God with our hearts, our hands, and our voices, is really the goal of our team. The goal of the team is to develop strategies to fulfill the vision. And so the visioning statement that group that Jason spoke of is here on this page. And if you go to the next page, Candy, this was what our goal is as a team to fulfill. So in this slide, what you're looking at is when we formed the team, we knew we needed to figure out how are we going to get to the point where we knew strategies that needed to be recommended that would help us get to that vision. And we determined that we needed a process to keep ourselves in a mode of moving forward. And so we developed a process. It started with what was our goal, and our goal came from our vision and the values and what that mission is going to look like to fulfill that. From there, we moved to the research phase, which is where we are right now. And so if you move down to the next line, the research phase involves learning and education, self-study, and then analysis and planning. So the self-study in the first step was to internally know our congregation. And that's where we are today with the research that we've done to point is to share with you what came from that. And how did we go about researching the congregation? That's in the last line. So what tools did we use? We used a SWOT analysis. Does anybody know what a SWOT analysis is? You can come off mute or type in the chat. Any guesses on what the SWOT stands for? Nobody? So it's basically looking at, the S stands for strengths. So we worked as a team separately to really just from each one of our own perspectives, list out what we thought the strengths of the church were, where we had some weaknesses, some opportunities, and then some threats. And we kind of looked at that. We came together. Everybody brought their thoughts. We consolidated that list. And that was our starting point. The next thing we did was we started into trying to determine how do we get to the point where we're going to be able to fulfill the vision. And one of the practices that Pastor Tanya had used in a past church where she was part of a similar team was to read the book called 5 Practices of a Fruitful Congregation. And you'll hear more about that book in a minute. But we've been reading that book to help us study and understand what are congregations doing today that is leading them to be able to grow and foster and minister and do the things that our vision speaks to. We did the congregation survey, which is why you're here tonight, to learn the results of the survey. And then our next step is the external point of the research. And what external refers to knowing our community. So we are going to be engaging in community interviews and surveys, looking at information about our city, such as the Jackson State of the City Dress, and etc. So that's where we'll move next. So back up to the top in the development, when we get through the research portion, we are intermittently in the periods of the research doing engagement, and that means with all of you. So one of the ways we're engaging you is through these town halls to share what we've been doing. There's also going to be a sermon series on the book so that you all will get to understand the 5 practices of fruitful congregations, and we'll be doing a book study. We're going to be providing regular updates, which Greg and Jason have been leading the effort of making sure there's information in Parish Tidings, as well as through the website, mail, email, and so on. We're going to try to use every avenue we can to make sure people are aware of what we're doing, which is part of our messaging to you, because we know that the vision can't be fulfilled without the engagement of the congregation to support what we're doing as a team. From there, once we have the research completed, the updates and feedback from you, we will be making recommendations or formulating strategies. Those strategies are where we feel the church needs to move to be able to fulfill the vision. Those strategies will be presented to all of you as well as to the Leadership Council for approval, and then that will move into our execution phase. The only way those strategies will get realized is through the outcomes and fulfilling what we find out in the research phase, if all of you are engaged and we have a way to make those strategies come to life. So that's an overview of our process that we are following as a team. The next step is a little bit more history about the research process. So the first thing we did was look at some history. So past efforts, we looked at what other types of strategic planning efforts have taken place and what were the results of those. We looked at the structure of the church, we looked at the membership of the church, and we also had people tell stories of places and things that they appreciated about the church. We used all of that to give us a historical picture of the past to help us move to the future. We also use the church database. So the church database provides information about our congregation, such as demographics, where people live, how long they've been members of the church. And one of the ways that we utilized the database was through our connectors program. So some of you may have been contacted by a church connector and touched base with over the holidays, and hopefully more recently through the Lenten season. And in those touch points, we ask our congregation connectors to engage in finding out, was the information in the database accurate? So did we still have the correct address phone number, email address, and so on, because that's very important for us to maintain that connection, but it also helps us better understand our congregation, which is what we're doing in this research phase. The next thing is the survey, so you can see that there's a blue box around that, because that's what we're here tonight to talk about, is the survey that went out with the 3 questions, and we ask all members and constituents to complete that and submit that back to us. And in a minute, Candy will tell you a little bit about that. And then the next step, again, along each one of those pieces in our process, that engagement or the feedback from the Congregation Leadership Council. Candy and I meet with Leadership Council, provide updates so that they're informed of the work that the team is doing. And that is what we are doing throughout the research process and the ways that we have been collecting and gathering the information. So now I'll turn it over to Candy to tell you a little bit about what we found in the research about knowing who we all are.
Thank you, Jan. Before we get into the survey results, I thought we'd talk a little bit about what our congregation looks like. And this information came from the database, and it helps give us a perspective on what we're all about. Our congregation is composed of about 740 members, or 40 congregants, which are composed of members and constituents. And constituents are those people who attend church on a fairly regular basis, but they're not members. They could be spouses of members, they could have gotten married in the church, but they have a connection to the church, and we see them with some frequency. We've got almost 500 members, and then about 250 constituents. And that's important because you'll see in the results how the results reflect what our congregation looks like. The age of our congregation, you'll see that about 24%, we don't know how old they are. Those are typically the non-members where that information hasn't been provided. But 11% are the teens and folks that are under 35. If you add the 45-year-old folks, that's 17%. Over 50% of our congregation are 46 years or more. Then our, there it goes. The gender, we're pretty much a 50-50 split as far as our gender goes. And then the number of years that members have been with the church. We've got over 230 members that have been with the church over 30 years. So that's almost 50% of our congregation. 18% have been with the church for 10 years or less. So that's just a little slice of the congregation, but it's an important piece. That's the growing piece. So when we look at our survey, you'll see that we sent out almost 740 surveys to members and constituents, and we only got 132 results back, or responses back, which doesn't sound real great. It is an 18% participation rate, which statistically is pretty good. And to put it in perspective, on a typical Sunday, we have about an average of 200 people attending, either virtually or in person. So to get 132 people responding to a survey, that's a pretty good response. Of the people who responded, 27% were 76 to 90 or to to 90. And then the folks that are over 65, that's almost 60% of the people who responded are over 65. 11% of the responders are 12 to 45 years old, which is kind of consistent with the composition of our congregation. The gender split, we had more women respond than we did men. And then the number of years that people have affiliated with the church, that would be both members and constituents. Over 50% have been with the church over 50 years, and 18% 10 years or less. So when you look at who responded and what our congregation looks like, we really think that we've got a good response, and that it reflects what the folks that are in our church. Now, we did get some responses that were outside the scope of what the strategic planning committee is working on, but we wanted to let you know about those topics and who it is that you can talk to get further information if you want. We won't be talking about these topics tonight because they are outside of our scope. We did get some questions relating to staff issues. Those belong to HR, to the staff parish committee, which has responsibility of the HR function at the church. And Earl Pileski chairs that committee. Some feedback around communication, which falls under leadership. And they provide, among the many things that they do, they provide guidance and direction to the committees and help us get the message out to folks on what's going on. Ted Ray is the one that is responsible for that committee. We had some questions about the United Methodist General Council, our General Conference, and the outcomes that are anticipated sometime in the future, maybe a couple years out. Those are things that Pastor Tanya and Greg can help with. And then feedback around post-COVID. There is a special reopening committee that's working on how do we emerge from COVID in a safe manner and bring people back in and engage in the activities of the church. So now Jan's going to talk a bit about the 5 fruitful processes of a congregation.
So earlier in the process slide, I referred to one of the tools that we were using is the book, The 5 Practices of Fruitful Congregations. So as we've been meeting, we have been looking to that book to provide some information for us to better understand what churches are doing that are successful and fulfilling a vision similar to ours. We also wanted to take the book and say, how with the feedback that we receive from the survey, can we correlate that feedback to the practices within the book? So we use this book as we analyze the data. So what you're going to see as the survey results are shared, you'll see these 5 practices as the categories that we grouped your feedback into. And this way, that helps us really better understand what are the things that we're doing today that churches that are growing and fostering and fulfilling a vision similar to ours are doing that we're already doing, and where are those areas within these 5 do we have opportunities. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what they are, so as the results are shared, you have a better understanding. So the first practice that churches that are considered fruitful congregations that they practice is radical hospitality. What do you think radical means? When you think of the word radical, what comes to mind?
Extreme.
Extreme. Okay. Anything else?
Outside of what we would normally think of a traditional hospitality.
Good. So outside of what we currently do, what else? Anybody else have thoughts? The key to this one in radical hospitality, if you look in the square there, it says invite, welcome, and connect. So when I think of hospitality, we're very easily recognize the welcome and connecting with each other who are within our congregation, but are we actively inviting? Do we actively have a desire to invite others? Do we receive and care for strangers, just as we do those that we are comfortable with? Can they come to Jackson First and find a spiritual home? So that's really what they're talking about with radical hospitality, is really that inviting spirit and welcoming strangers within our environment. The second one is passionate worship. So when you hear the word passionate, what do you think of?
Intense.
Intense. What else?
Energetic.
Energetic. What else?
From the heart.
From the heart. Yeah, so if you think about anything that you have a passion for, it usually gives you an opportunity to transform. You're engaged, you have a drive, you really show your commitment to it. And that's what this is talking about. Is our worship one that renews us, transforms us, brings us together? Is that what we're doing when we have our worship? Is it making Sundays the most important day of the week with that hour of worship? The most important on everybody's list. The third practice of a fruitful congregation is intentional faith development. When you think of the word intentional, what comes to mind?
Doing something on purpose.
Having a purpose, absolutely. What else do we think of when we think of deliberate? Or intentional, we think of deliberate. Sorry, it's answered my own question. It's Monday. So it really means that as we think of having intentional faith development, that we grow in the faith and knowledge of God, we make a deliberate effort, we're purposeful in our actions, and we make it a priority. The fourth one is risk-taking mission and service. If you're a risk-taking, what does that mean?
It's going to mean you try something outside of our comfort zone.
Yeah.
If you see that you don't know how you're going to address, you're going to give it a shot.
Absolutely. Yep. So stepping outside of our comfort zone, what else might risk-taking mission and service be?
I would think it would include things that, well, you don't wait for all the pieces to fall into perfect alignment. You take a chance. You go for it. Maybe before all the, everything's perfect.
Yep. So we may step and jump before we feel like we have everything we need. So in risk-taking mission and service, they're really saying, are the things that you're involved in from a mission and service standpoint, are we making positive differences in the life of others? Is our purpose driven towards Christ? Are we taking on those missions and services that really are outside of our comfort zone, as Barb shared, things that we may have not engaged in the past, but maybe we should be because the need exists. So taking maybe a different lens of how we use our gifts and talents in the mission and service area. And then the last one is extravagant generosity. When you think of the word extravagant, what comes to mind?
Over the top.
Over the top. What else?
Totally selfless.
Totally selfless. Good. Like it. So yes, this is really unselfishness, just as Barb shared, in our willingness to give in order to make that positive difference that we might find we're doing in the risk-taking mission and service, or in other areas where we feel that generosity is really going to go for a positive result. So that's how your responses are bucketed. They're based on these 5 practices. So as we go through the questions, you're going to see these categories, and then Jason will follow up what I share with you, some very specific details around why it fell into these buckets. So question 1, and Candy, if you want to go ahead. Question 1 asks you, what 3 things about Jackson First brings you the greatest joy and satisfaction? So we first looked at the demographic information on each question. So as Candy shared, the congregation of our makeup was very similar to the results of the survey participants. So it was very reflective of our membership. And you can see that the yellow bar, which for all areas of age, fell under passionate worship. And that really seemed to be that was one of the top 3 for all age groups within our congregation that they really felt brought them joy and satisfaction. The next one, which is the red bar, which is the intentional faith development, again, that meant really being deliberate and purposeful in how we look at how we develop our faith. That, again, was important for the majority of 46 and over in those age groups. So that's a good 75% of our population falls above the age of 46. And then it was important a little bit less for those in the younger brackets there. And then the third one that really rose to your top 3 was the radical hospitality. So you can see, again, thinking of hospitality within our congregation, those 56 and older really felt that that was important, and that was the third top 3. So then we looked at what were the main reasons that people grouped those as their top 3 things that brought them the most joy and satisfaction. So if we start at the bottom here, radical hospitality, why people felt that was really important was because they feel we're welcoming, they like to be together, and they really value the fellowship and friendship that they have within the church. Under passionate worship, music by far was the most important to people in that category, with worship service being really important at 11, and then the use that we've been able to use technology through COVID was important to people, that they were able to still worship even though they couldn't be together. And then up above that, our intentional faith development, spiritual growth was just as important as passionate worship. And then paying attention to how do we develop youth and children, and then the camp experience and participating in small groups. And then the last one there that was important but really didn't make the top 3 was in the service that we do to others. So those that participate in some of the mission and service events, that was the next one that brought people joy and satisfaction. So now Jason's going to kind of give you even a little bit more detail than what's broken down here in specific things that relate to each one of these categories.
Thanks, Jan. So on the screen is something we call a word cloud. And a word cloud is simply a software program that we utilize to kind of give a demonstration of the things we're talking about tonight. So as opposed to numbers and charts and graphs, we simply plugged in the responses that we received. And the word cloud software essentially uses an algorithm to assign weight to common phrases, common words that were found in all of the responses that we received. So this kind of gives you a kind of a symbolic representation of those comments that we received in response to question 1, which was, what are those things that bring you the most joy and satisfaction with our church? not surprising as we've done these meetings with everybody. It seems like the common theme across question one, worship, the worship experience and the music program. I think if you grouped those two, you would see those had a lot of the responses, and a lot of the themes that came out of question one had to do with the worship experience and the music program in general. When talking about worship, common themes that were identified had to do with the quality of the sermons, the ability by the congregants to relate to the Sunday message, the strong abilities of Pastor Tanya, Deacon Greg, Tim Junior, and the staff in general. In their responses, congregants noted that the overall worship experience was enhanced by such thing as the beautiful and historic sanctuary, the organ, the piano, and the ability to worship near friends and family on at least a weekly basis. Within the category of music, respondents identified kind of over and over again their love of the music program in general. In specific, they made comments in regards to the strong chancel choir, the special holiday programs, Tim Junior's ability to bring a wide variety of music programs to life, and obviously the music produced by the piano and the organ. Congregants spoke fondly of past musical productions by children's and youth choirs. So it's clear that the music ministry has had a deep and long-lasting impact on the life of our congregation. And it's something that continues to bring true joy and happiness to the lives of our congregation. In another bucket, we identified faith, fellowship, friendship, and connections. These are all high priorities for our congregation. It's clear that we value the friendships that we've made over the many years with each other. For many, congregants are more than just people that they sit next to in a pew on a Sunday. They forge strong, meaningful relationships with each other. And we think due to COVID, the fact that we haven't been around each other a lot over the last 14 months now, I think that came through on the survey, that people were yearning to be together again, and they missed that connectivity of being with each other. We received many comments in response to number one about compassionate people, loving people, warm, friendly faces of the congregation. They talked about the hospitality program. Many references were made to family camp and the connections that have been made to attending camp over many years. References were made to What a Wednesday meals and the fellowship that exists around sharing food with one another. Fellowship and connections were also made in references to Bible studies, small group programs, Sunday school programs, other groups like the United Methodist Women were referenced in the survey. And we also had a lot of comments, like Jan said, about just an appreciation of the technology that we've implemented in the last 12 months since COVID, that's essentially allowed us to bring service in a different way to the congregation, and the connections that technology has allowed. We're proud of the fact that we haven't missed a Sunday during COVID. We've been able to live stream that. We did receive a lot of comments on the technology improvements that have been made. Another area that received a lot of comments in this question revolved around community, missions, and service to others. Our church very much values connections to the community and the ability to serve others in missions. People made specific comments to the Fresh Food Initiative, the backpack program, the summer back to school blast, the great work of the wellness team, the kitchen ministry, local missions, quilters, prayer groups, the Christmas giving program that we do every year. The congregation appreciates the community connections and the ability to provide services to our neighbors. And there were also many comments on the Utes, the the young adults and the various missions trips that they've made up north. All of these came together in the comments that we received to response number 1. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So question number 2 was a follow-up from 1, but we asked, now that you shared with us the 3 joys, what were the 3 things that you saw would become the biggest challenges for us to again achieve our vision at Jackson First? And what we found here, again, very similar in our results. So those 46 and above pretty much felt aligned in their top 3. And again, if you look at the yellow, which was passionate worship, even though that was rated in the top 3 of the things that bring people joy, there also was opportunities for us presented in the challenges area. The second, again, the blue bar, which is the radical hospitality. So again, even though that was within the top 3 of our joys, it also fell into our top 3s of challenges, and that went across pretty much all of our age demographics, that there was opportunities within radical hospitality. And then the last one, again, our intentional faith development, really only showed up in the ages between 56 and 75 as having opportunities for us. So again, we took the responses, we used our 5 practices of fruitful congregations, and we tried to take a look at what were those factors that had people ranking the 3 top challenges in these areas. So if we look at the top here, under radical hospitality, you can see that one of the challenges that we have is we don't really have young families and young adults that we are welcoming and inviting. Some felt that the congregation is judgmental at times, that when visitors come, they're not always welcoming to visitors like they are to those that they worship with on a regular basis. And the decreasing membership created challenges across all of these areas, but really showed up in how we fellowship and welcome each other. The next bucket under passionate worship, even though technology was recognized, as Jason said, as providing us the opportunities through COVID, many felt that there was technology opportunities and that we lacked some flexibility in our worship. The next one was that there was some concerns, again, as Candy said, outside of the scope of this team, but really what is the denomination, where is it heading based on recent looking at that as a whole. Sorry, my brain is not working well tonight here, but so, and then the last one there is that many felt that even though music was so important, and it still is, that we had an opportunity to integrate potentially more contemporary music into our worship services. Then the third one there, in our intentional faith development, many felt that the lack of engagement and having enough lay leadership was a challenge in providing where we could have opportunities for intentional faith development. That what were we going to possibly be looking at for post-COVID? So would some of those things that we had previously, there was concerns about those same activities being able to be sustained once we get back to whatever the new normal is. And then the third one there, again, lack of programs for our children and adults. So even though we found intentional faith development to be very important, many felt the challenges is that we don't have these things to help us move in that direction. And then under risk-taking and mission, as Jason said, many found very much joy and celebration and participating in things like wellness and the food programs, backpack, and so on. Many felt, though, that there was, due to an aging congregation, that we had a lack of people participating in outreach, and that we don't have membership that's diverse to help us take a look at those areas of mission and service that we maybe are not engaged in today. And then the last one, in the extravagant generosity, many had concerns about financial challenges with the decreasing membership, and also about the building, as beautiful as it is, it requires a level of care that requires a financial support to ensure that the facility stays in the condition it can be and should be. So now, again, Jason's going to give you all a little bit more detail around those large categories.
Thanks, Jan. So this screen is simply similar to the first one that you saw, another word cloud that we generated, simply taking those responses from question number 2 that kind of highlighted those levels of concern for our church at the moment. So as you can see by the weight of those larger words there, probably not a surprise to some people that kind of one bucket of concern that we can group these things in would be lack of children, youth, young people, young families, and decreasing membership. To us, it seems clear from the survey, those items were most heavily noted by the congregants in their responses. In connections with these concerns is the fact that the congregation is aging and the associated issues that come with that, including lack of volunteers for certain activities, a sense of burnout by some of those who have played active roles in the past, leadership concerns. Are there people that are going to be stepping up as time goes on to head some of these committees? Continuity concerns. Are there, we may have leaders in certain positions at this point, but do we have another kind of batch of leaders that can step up after that? There's also concerns, as Jan noted, about maintaining an aging facility. Obviously, it's a beautiful building, but due to its age, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with a building that age. There were concerns noted about, viability of the building and funding expenses down the road connected to the aging facility. Just kind of general concerns over financing and meeting bills and just, as membership declines, are we going to have the same level of support as we have in the past and that we currently do at the moment? Declining membership numbers and fewer young people obviously is a common theme. Congregants also pointed to certain cultural trends, the sense that people just aren't taking church as seriously as they may have, or they don't make it a priority. Certain social changes were noted. Essentially, some concerns were noted about the long-term, viability of the church if more diverse people don't get involved. Another bucket that we identified was essentially staffing and communication concerns. Staffing in the sense of not a displeasure with the current staff, but a desire potentially to look at expanding jobs or expanding roles for certain things that people have identified. And those were mostly in the areas of youth development, child development, family ministries and programs. There were a lot of comments centered around looking into hiring a person or creating a position that would be specifically focused on some of these things that were brought out in the survey. Congregants also voiced concern with, in terms of communication, just, maybe we could do a better job of expressing certain initiatives or new programs or new ideas that in general, potentially we could do a better job of communicating those things. Past staffing issues. When Deacon Greg was hired, there were some statements made that we could have done a better job at communicating his new role and his current duties. So some of the comments that we received centered around just kind of communication issues. As Jan noted, there were comments on essentially the other bucket that we identified was inclusion and diversity. We received a lot of comments around that we all look a lot alike, and that a lot of us come from the same kind of socio-economic backgrounds. That, you know, there's essentially an inclusion issue there and a diversity issue, that we may be welcoming to each other, but we essentially aren't kind of looking outside and at ways of how we can welcome kind of you know, people that don't exactly look like us into the church. There were comments by some that we may be judgmental to visitors or to outsiders. There were comments about that in some aspects we may be cliquish, that we have a tendency to associate with kind of the same group over and over, and just not welcoming to new people into our church. Centered around programming, there was a desire by respondents to see more small groups, additional faith development activities, additional things like Bible studies, expanded Sunday school offerings. There were a lot of comments on looking at alternative worship services. So in question 1, you know, worship was identified as a strength. In response to 2, you know, there were some statements made at, you know, looking at, you know, alternative ways of worship, maybe experimenting with days other than Sunday, looking at offering those things at night, and also looking at potentially different types of music, potentially working off of the success of the What a Wednesday meals that we've done on Wednesday. So there were a lot of comments on what we called alternative worship services and experiences, essentially in the hopes of expanding our outreach and our audience of people that would be attending those events. There seemed to be a desire for congregants to expand upon the current offerings being provided at the moment, or create new programs altogether to appeal to a wider variety of audiences. Other concerns noted in question 2 had to do with COVID-19 and essentially the reopening and all of those issues that come with the reopening. A lot of statements centered around a desire to get back to normal, you know, essentially resume operations much as they were before the pandemic began. Essentially, people just, as we all do, have questions on what is the new normal going to look like. You know, are those things that they were used to and accustomed to before COVID still going to be there? So we saw a lot of questions around that. And so that's the summary there in question number 2.
Thank you, Jason. So the last question that we asked really took the barriers away and said, if nothing stood in your way and you had a magic wand, what would you add, change, enhance, or stop doing at the church? And again, the demographics were the same across this question. So those in the category of, you know, 45 and above were aligned and the same with those below. So we didn't include the demographics here, but they fell across the same spectrum. And those things that were most important to you, and the top 3 things that you would do based on the buckets that we saw. Under radical hospitality, many of you made suggestions around advertising, increasing our diversity efforts, and increasing our communication. Under passionate worship, you would enhance technology. Again, different worship and music, and many of you had lots of suggestions on what that might look like. And then again, additional support in our staffing areas around our ministers to be able to provide a more passionate worship experience. And then intentional faith development, again, it's circled around those same areas around youth and family activities and programs that, again, most of you identified as challenges. And then in risk-taking and mission, many of you felt strongly that we really needed to increase our community outreach, felt strongly about opening the building to the community, and really looking at what is our mission work that we're doing today. And then in the last one, extravagant generosity. Many of you thought there was opportunities there to create a way to update the building and the parking situation, and then look at ways that we can provide funding for the programs and staff that were recommended. So again, Jason will give you more of the detail behind those things that you all said you would love to see happen or not when you were offered the opportunity with no barriers.
Yep, so for our final word cloud here, obviously this is showing again kind of those common themes that we pulled out of the responses to item 3. Few people took item 3 and addressed it kind of word for word what we were asking for, and then some people, which was okay, kind of gave some solutions. So we got kind of a variety of answers in response to question 3. But no matter how you responded to it, some of the themes that we pulled out, similar to the concerns that were raised in number 2, here in 3, where they're kind of addressing those challenges. A lot of people had comments around hiring staff, staff specifically focused on children, youth, young adults, and families. Hiring of staff specifically focused on developing and leading a children's music ministry program. A lot of comments, a lot of suggestions around, once again, on technology. So again, in some cases, we saw it as a strength identified in number 1. We saw it as a challenge for some people in number 2. And then we'd see it again as a theme in number 3 that essentially said, hey, technology is something we can use to improve ourselves and to advance ourselves going forward. So a lot of comments on using technology to improve the overall worship experience. So including audio, visual, sound enhancements. And again, another staffing issue, we had some comments on looking at hiring staff that would be specifically focused on technology issues, not just on Sunday, but kind of throughout a week, throughout a month, that these people would just be focused on technology issues and enhancing overall technology capabilities. We had comments about expanding our outreach to the community and to our downtown neighbors. This included comments on expanding our reach to the new housing developments and the new apartments that now surround us. Getting a greater understanding of the need of the city and her residents. Looking at expanding community partnerships, expanding our kitchen ministry to provide food and meals to those who need it most, becoming more engaged with and involved in the community. Suggestions were hosting open houses, barbecues, block parties, essentially things to get to know who it is that we surround ourselves with downtown. We also had comments on expanding the current worship experience. Again, we saw some of these comments in response to question 2. Again, in question 3, we saw statements about looking at expanding or creating a non-traditional service option. This would be exploring different times, different types of music that would be played, utilizing outside speakers and just people with different backgrounds to come and talk, essentially with a goal of expanding our appeal to a greater audience. There were comments about expanding our current online worship offerings, and we even had comments about looking at radio simulcasting and things like that. I think there was some of that in the past. Some of those items were brought up again here. There were comments on expanding the current programming offerings, essentially to provide greater opportunities for spiritual development among all groups. Expand engagement with shut-ins and those in long-term care facilities. Expand upon the success of What a Wednesday evenings and opportunities to eat and share meals with one another. Expand upon Bible studies, Sunday school opportunities, and other small group offerings. Quite a few comments on building usage. These centered around making better use of our building to build connections to the community and attract potential new members. opening the sanctuary to concerts, lectures, organ symposiums. There were even comments that we shouldn't be locking the doors to the church. There were comments about allowing outside groups to have greater access to our building to host events and special programs. Look at utilizing the building for emergency relief and special shelters, provide disaster response facilities. There were even suggestions on decluttering the space, taking a serious look at cleaning out closets, utilizing a commercial service to clean the building to make it more welcoming and appealing. Really take a look at all of the spaces that we're using at the moment, with an eye at attracting younger families and youth. How can we make a certain space more desirable for those people to want to hang out in those spaces. There were comments on modernizing the family room, the parlor, updating our bathrooms, and also about expanding parking availability. And finally, in response to 3, marketing and getting our message out. That was another theme that seemed to come through in response to number 3. Essentially expanding upon and enhancing our internal communication processes. We had a few comments about installing signage on Michigan Ave, enhancing our internet connection throughout the building, essentially to just get that up to current standards. Develop a marketing and advertising campaign that would utilize social media, blogs, podcasts, essentially anything that would get our message out to a greater audience, and just kind of a general sense that we needed to raise visibility and awareness of our church and our mission through a focused marketing and advertising strategy. So those were the main themes there in question number 3. So those are the comments from the survey for responses to number 1, number 2, and number 3. So we hope we didn't overwhelm you there in that discussion there. And so when we were in person, we essentially had cards that everybody filled out, and we wanted people to share. And so here on Zoom, I think the best thing is we can utilize the chat function. It's a small enough group. If people have comments, really the 2 questions there in front of your screen, sit down and write one thing that surprised you about the results that we talked about tonight. And then the question number 2 is essentially one thing that did not surprise you about the results we shared tonight. Spend a couple minutes thinking of, like I said, we can utilize the chat function. There aren't that many of us in this group tonight, so feel free to chime in with those things. We just want to create a discussion around those items and see if there's anything we can assist with tonight. As Jan and Candy have said, we're going to have continual discussions as this process goes on. So this was really just the intro to this process and the reveal of the results of this part of the survey. The next step is going to be engaging with the community as a whole. So we're going to be learning a lot from our community as we go forward over the next month. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to share as we go forward. So spend a couple minutes, think about those questions, and we'll come back and chat about those. We know we've gone over, so we won't take up a lot of your time tonight. So we appreciate everybody joining us this evening.
And if you're uncomfortable with chat, and just want to unmute and share a thought about what surprised you or what didn't surprise you, I will be happy to take notes as well.
So what are your comments or feedback for us tonight after this data presentation? What do you want us to hear?
Do you want to chat it or you want to say it?
No, I don't. I can't see myself on the video, but this is Jennifer Noble.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hello. I'm kind of surprised that given the average age of the respondents, that there seems to be a real call for, I don't know, I'm just going to call it more modern worship. I'm surprised by that. I'm not displeased, but I thought that was interesting, whether it's different days or different music, or I don't know, but I thought that was interesting.
I did too. I was surprised by that as well.
So Barb, you said in the chat that you weren't surprised overall. Why not?
Put you on the spot.
I guess because I think that's what a Christian heart desires. I mean, that's kind of what, when we come to church, those are the things that I think it's a natural desire to want those things. Nobody goes to church and doesn't want to have a strong worship service or good ministry outside. And even Isaac wants to know when we can start doing the snacks after church.
That's Landon's most important question.
And I guess I think all these things are great, but it will need lots of prayer and lots of energy. Because I think we're going to do these things and sometimes nobody's going to show up, and we're just going to have to make the commitment to continue doing it. And just pray for us to have the patience for it to grow. And maybe I'm not on base, but it's just some things just are going to take time to evolve because we don't have, I mean, Sunday school classes, when I was teaching in Sunday school just the last few years, you know, it was just a small group of kids. So it's just like, but they expect it to be there. And sometimes I don't think if you're not involved, you don't realize how much work it takes to have a Sunday school every Sunday. And if there's participation or not, somebody has to be there, somebody has to set it up, somebody has to commit.
Yeah. It's one of those things people miss when it's not there, but when it's there, people might not acknowledge that everything it takes for it to be there on Sunday.
Right.
Thank you for sharing. Peggy, did you have any thoughts?
One of the things that has occurred to me is I am surprised that there was a lot of emphasis on things like alternative types of worship. When you just, you mentioned that the largest proportion of people were older, and we're more apt, and I'm one of the older ones, and we're more apt to think that we're more staid and we're more like the way things are, we like our services are kind of predictable, and not that they're boring. I don't mean that, but just that, having lively music, or not really coming out too well with this, but at any rate, I'm a little bit surprised that there was a lot of emphasis. And I think maybe it's because we all realize that we do need to have younger people, because I'm just worn out from listening to this list. So.
Appreciate your feedback, and you're right. It may be that people put the lens on and said, if we're going to get younger families and younger children and youth, maybe we need not necessarily to change what we have, Peggy, but offer an addition. So that could have been one of the adds, because the question really asked add, subtract, enhance. So I think that might have fell in the bucket of adding rather than subtracting.
I can remember quite a few years back when we did something similar to that. We had two services again at that time, and the early service was more contemporary styled worship service with music that was, but it didn't seem to last very long. I couldn't tell you how many years it lasted, but I do remember that we had tried it once. And like I've been a member a long, long time, so I really can't remember when, but.
Well, thank you, Peggy. Appreciate that. Anybody else like to share? Okay, well, if you think of something after, because to Peggy's point, it is a lot of information and she's exhausted just thinking about all the things that we may or may not take on. But if you think of something else and you'd like us to have your perspective, you can always reach out to someone on the team, and we'd be happy to incorporate your feedback as we, go into further research and look towards developing strategies. So the last thing we wanted to kind of share with you before we say good evening is just going back to our process slide, and again, asking for your help. So as I stated earlier, the next step in our research is to really know the community. And before you all got on, we were chatting that Pastor Tanya was sharing that, many people are wondering, what will Jackson look like when we really come out of COVID? Is it what it is today? Will it still evolve? What's changed? And not necessarily just even due to COVID, but what are the things that are happening and where are the challenges within the community? So that's our next step, is to start engaging in those community interviews and surveys. So we're looking for volunteers to partner with us. It'd be teams of 2, somebody to scribe, somebody to ask and listen to the questions and help us gather the research. So if you're interested in partnering, we would love to have you participate. And again, you can put it in the chat if you're interested, or just reach out to any of us. We'll have, tools to help do the research with scripts and so forth. So we wouldn't put anybody out on their own, but we definitely know that to get this completed, we need additional help. And again, we'll continue to engage through these types of things, town halls and so on. So that's where we are at. So if no one has any other questions or comments, thank you again, as Candy said, for joining and participating tonight. Welcome your participation in any way that you may want to engage. So with that, if no one has anything else, we will enjoy the rest of our evenings.
Thanks, guys, for participating.
Thank you for all of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.